Good morning, everybody. Welcome to day 3, the last day of our digital family seminar. I hope, I pray that this was something super encouraging for our families of our church at Revival Center. I pray that not just for those that are in Revival Center, but all churches that have been able to be here and watch this. I hope that it greatly encouraged you and made you be challenged, and it helped you maybe see things from a different perspective, and maybe you saw some things in your own life that you're like, wow, I never would have thought about that. I know just for me personally, the last 3 days has just been this time where I've been very self-reflective of everything that Sister Gabi has been talking about, and there are things that I've been bringing up in prayer with God that has really challenged me, that I never knew and thought about was there. And I pray that that's what's happening in all of us, that we can grow and that our families can become stronger, and then from that the kingdom of God can go forward in a greater and healthier way than it ever has before. And today, I do want to let everyone know that since this is our last day, make sure in the comments and everything you're saying all your thanks to Sister Gabi, and anything encouraging that you got out of this. I want to say to you, you can put those in the comments, or of course you can send them to us at the number that will be posted in the comments in there. And I want you guys to, really, really feel like you can voice your opinion. But at the same time, if you have any questions for Sister Gabi, as we've been doing, we will have that question and answer at the end. So today, since it's our last session, I want us to pray again, but this time I want us to pray for our students. I want us to pray, if you're parents, I want you to pray over your children, and grandparents, pray over your grandchildren. And I want us to think, about helping our youth out, helping our students out, helping our hyphens out. It's really important that we understand what's going on in their minds and how can we help them, how can we encourage them. And I pray today that as we are learning, that we are understanding it, but at the same time, we're taking it into our hearts and into our lives, and we're going to push it out and help everyone that we can in our churches and all the youth that we are connected to. So this is really, really important today. And as a teacher, I've seen a lot of things. I've experienced a lot of situations with my own students that I thought, man, I wish I could help them more. And then being a youth pastor, I've been like overwhelmed sometimes trying to help out some of our students. And this year we had the chance of listening to Sister Gabi at our Community West, which is the Western District's kind of conference to help youth workers and youth pastors out. And so today's lesson kind of comes from what we heard there. And I know it's going to impact you as it impacted me. It changed how I talk to my students. It changed how I talk to to the youth in my church. And so today, as we pray, I want you to take this I want you to say, God, open my heart, open my life, that I can receive this. So let's pray right now. Lord God, we thank you, Jesus, for everything that you have done this weekend already. Thank you, dear God, for the time that we have spent on this. And God, I pray, Jesus, that as we are going through this today, as we are listening, Lord, let this get deep within our hearts to help the students, to help our youth, God, to help our children, Lord, and to be positive, to be lights for them, dear God, to be encouragers for them. I pray, Lord, let us receive this with open arms, God, and let us not hold back anything. Anoint our hearts to receive this, and anoint Sister Gabi today. In Jesus' name. And everyone said, in Jesus' name. So,
Jesus.
without further ado, I want to introduce Sister Gabi. Those of you that have not been here with us, she is a licensed family and marriage therapist who comes in high demand, as I've been saying, and she's taken this time out for us, and we're greatly encouraged and grateful to her for doing this with us. So, as you guys can see, we have the number there displayed for you all. So, if there's anything that you want to do, or any questions that you have, any comments, please send them there. And if you want the notes, you can also send it to that number, your email to that number, and then we can get that and send it to you. Okay? Without further ado, Sister Gabi, take your liberty, and thank you so much for being here with us.
Amen. Thank you so much, Brother Josh. Again, I want to give honor to Revival Center, to your pastor, Pastor Todd Johnson, his family, the ministerial body, all of the church members, all of the youth workers, youth leaders, Brother Josh and Sister Jeanette Aguilera. They have a heart for young people, a heart for God, a heart for positively impacting their communities, and that is inspiring. And so it's an honor for me to be here with all of you on this Saturday morning. You guys could be doing many other things, but you chose to be here this morning, and I believe God will honor your sacrifice, and I believe that we can learn something from today's session. It has been a joy to be with you all the last 3 days. We kind of touched on different topics in the past 3 days. We opened up on Thursday with parental wounds, and we talked about a lot of the inherited trauma that we can have as adults, and unconsciously we can pass along certain things to maybe our children, or even in our families. We can be triggered by different things that we may not have ever known were issues for us. And so the point of that was not to despair. We all carry wounds with us. We all have had hurts and pain and suffering. And thankfully, Christ is here to help us, to take the burdens that we've carried with us all of our lifetimes, to break these generational curses so that we don't have to continue the same patterns with future generations. So we did that on Thursday. Yesterday, we talked a bit about parent-child relationships. So we started from birth, and we spent a lot of time in childhood, went to the teenage years, and even to young adulthood. So we did cover that. And today, our topic is mental health issues in youth. And we're going to talk about signs, symptoms, and addictions. I would say disclaimer for addictions, there is going to be a short piece, but a piece that we do bring up sexual addictions. So if you or someone around you, you're not comfortable with having them hear this, I just want to put a disclaimer that once we get to the addictions piece, there will be some sexual addiction that we will talk about lightly. And with that, we'll go ahead and get started. The verse that we've been referencing this conference is 1 Peter 5:7. It simply says, casting all your care upon him, for he cares for you. I believe that God cares for all of us. He cares for our physical health. He cares for our emotional health, our psychological health. And so the point of this seminar is not to create, again, a gloom and doom picture, but to really bring awareness to what the enemy has maybe tried to hush up and sweep under the rug. And when we bring attention to those things, that might be lingering in the darkness, once light hits those things, freedom comes, liberty comes, healing comes. And so that's really the point of what we are doing today. So some common mental health issues that we're talking about today are going to be depression, anxiety, low self-esteem, and a bit about self-harm. For addictions, we're going to focus more on substance use and pornography, but we are definitely going to cover some addictions and some of the psychology behind them. So I want to open up this presentation with this image that says if feelings could talk. So a lot of times we might, notice a feeling maybe in yourself and people around you, the youth that you work with, the children in your life, and we may not be able to express what we're thinking and feeling. And children, especially, they might need, and young people, they might need some skills, right, to be able to express their thoughts and their feelings. So in this slide, we cover a few different emotions and some reasons behind why we might be feeling certain things, so sadness, loneliness, shame, resentment, emptiness, anger, anxiety, and stress. So all of these emotions we can say are normal, right? We talked about the purpose behind emotions. It makes us human. God gave us emotions. We read about different emotions that come up in the Bible with different people that God has used. And so it's important to explore more about our mental health. Again, to create an awareness, to create a recognition about things that might have been kept in the darkness all this time. But this morning, we're going to bring them to light. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the sources of mental health issues. And by mental health, I am being very broad in in this term, because there are many mental health disorders, but we're going to focus mainly on anxiety and depression just because they seem to be some of the more common ones. But you can also apply this to other mental health issues, maybe ADHD, maybe some other developmental or learning disorders. So I'm focusing again on some of the big ones, anxiety and depression, but there are other ones that are not included in this list as well. So I listed 3 different reasons why we might experience mental health issues. And this is based on different research, and people who practice faith-based counseling. They have seen these types of things as well. So the first source of mental health issue could be biological. And I'm going to go into depth for each of these sources, but first is biological, and we break that up into chemical imbalances, something in the brain that's not right. We can also link generational, right, or a higher likelihood to develop a certain mental health issue based on maybe our mother or our father or our grandparent or somebody in the family, is highly anxious. So growing up, we may have caught on to that, and we may have learned that that's the way to cope with things, to stress out, to be anxious, to, struggle with these mental health issues. And the caregiver could be very well meaning. They may not even be aware of some of the mental health issues that they're struggling with. But we are all relational beings, right? We all live in community. So my actions are going to affect your actions, whether or not we want to believe it, and vice versa. We all influence each other, especially in a family unit. The second source of mental health issues is emotional or psychological. So we have been talking about trauma and the impacts of trauma. So, we can link abuse in there, neglect. We can link abandonment, divorce, separations. All of that can have a psychological effect on a person. For some people, it may be traumatic. For others, they might have more resiliency skills or resiliency abilities, and the same situation may not impact people in the same way. So with siblings, one sibling might adapt very well to change. Another one might struggle with that. So this is where trauma comes in. Another source of mental health issue so 2B, is situational. So for example, right now during the pandemic, right, this could be a situational source of stress. Why? Because a lot of families have been quarantined together, or just individuals might maybe have been quarantined alone, and the isolation or the, just feeling overwhelmed in a house with so many different people all at once, that could be a situational source of stress, meaning that if the quarantine is over and things can go back to quote unquote normal, the person may not experience an ongoing of anxiety, stress, depression. So that could be one piece. 2C is chronic or reoccurring. So say, for example, a young person has struggled with anxiety, especially in childhood, but once they come to their teenage years, they've gotten the tools that they needed. Maybe they entered into, some faith-based counseling. Maybe they linked up with their youth pastors, are in a very strong and thriving youth group. They're finding talents and interests about themselves, and they're starting to like themselves bit by bit. So what happens is the anxiety or depression that they may have experienced in childhood becomes much more manageable, maybe even goes away, once they get the coping skills that they need. Say something stressful then happens later on, like I mentioned, family stress, a divorce, going off to college, something that happens later on. Those same feelings of just feeling overwhelmed, feeling scared, anxious, even depressed can come up again in different stages of life. And so a mental health issue that was maybe just fine, again, we had coping skills in place, we had a strong relationship with God, connection with others, but maybe the person finds themselves later on without all of these things. If the mental health issue is recurring or chronic, it can come up again. So we want to pay attention to the source or some of the reasons behind some mental health issues. And 3 can be spiritual. Of course, secular counselors, secular psychologists and therapists may not agree with this, but we know as people of God that the enemy uses different tactics to attack the people of God. And some of those could be planting negative thoughts into our mind, just speaking just horrible negative things to us. And if we, pay attention to that, if we give ear to that, if we give more importance, than it needs to, that can be a spiritual attack. Also we can open doors to different things that the enemy throws our way, whether consciously or unconsciously. We can open a door to something that the enemy then can use against us. And that's when these spiritual attacks can come in. Okay, so here in these next few slides, we have some more detail about what we talked about. So if you might notice, we are in this day and age experiencing physical illnesses, viruses that were rare or even didn't exist in the past. Right? In years past, we had other, maybe illnesses and things like that. But in recent years, especially in this century, we have learned of new physical illnesses that have afflicted the body. A second point is that if you look at maybe old literature, or maybe even like old classic movies where you see people with a certain weight, and then you compare that to nowadays where we struggle with just maintaining our weight over time based on the food that we have put into our body, the preservatives inside of them, natural versus processed foods, and just the way our body has adapted to that has significantly changed the way our body gets nutrition or doesn't get nutrition, the way that we think, the way that our body works. And so all of these biological changes have started to catch up with us in a way that in years past maybe we didn't see before, or we didn't see it at the levels that they're at today. So nutrition, believe it or not, can help depression or anxiety, or can it actually make it worse. There's a lot of research on the power of nutrition and putting good things into our body, that we naturally feel better when we nourish our bodies. Why? Because God wants us to do that. We may lack certain nutrients or certain chemicals in our brain that can influence our emotional state. For some people, there might be a chemical imbalance, a biological issue. And so for some people, it might be necessary to stabilize certain hormones, stabilize certain chemicals in the brain. And for some people, again, a short-term medication could be helpful. I want to follow the guidance of your pastor. Whatever he teaches and encourages, I do not want to go against that. So if you have any questions about that specifically or any doubts, I would really encourage you to follow the guidance of your pastor and to seek wisdom with that. So again, I'm not advocating lifelong medication, and at the same time, there could be some benefits with a short-term medication to stabilize different things. And after that, incorporate counseling, incorporate therapy, incorporate coping skills, prayer, godly devotion. So all of these things are in collaboration with other things, with other skills, other coping mechanisms that we have in place. Anxiety, depression, and trauma can also run in our families, like we talked about earlier, and this can actually increase our likelihood as children, or it can increase the likelihood of your children to develop a mental health issue at some point. Again, this is not to say that this cannot be fixed. Our environment has a lot to do with how we behave, how we think, how we process information. So even if biologically you might have a higher likelihood, that doesn't mean that we can't manage that we can't squash that we can't not develop that in the first place. Okay, so this brings us to second source, emotional. So just like we talked about earlier, and I'm not going to go into detail too much because we talked a lot about this just a few minutes ago, but situational, reoccurring, or chronic mental health issues. Also, just needing some space to process the past, to process disappointment, hurt, abandonment. Sometimes when we have family conflict, parents may not realize how much it can impact the children. So if that has happened, it's never too late. We can repair bonds. We can create a sense of safety and trust, like we've been talking about the last few days. But I just want to highlight that can definitely be a consequence of family stress, of separations, of domestic violence, and just an unhealthy family structure. So with Christian counseling, we kind of get the best of both worlds, right? Because we learn different tools we learn how our brain works, we learn how our body works, we learn the connection between feelings, thoughts, and behaviors, and we also have the Christian component to that. We learn how Christ sees us. We learn how the enemy can attack our minds and our thoughts and try to take territory that way. So when we are aware, when we fill ourselves with this knowledge, we are able to fight against the enemy and combat anything he is trying to throw our way, our children's way, our family's way, and our church's way. So the third source is spiritual. So just like we talked about earlier, we can open the door to demonic influence with the music we listen to, the things that we watch, the games that we play. Some things are too real in terms of, video games and things like that. The simulations are like just mind-blowing how real it seems. And a person can put themselves, they can, go over a level, go over a threshold where it's no longer a game. It actually feels very real. And in those cases, we can open the door to spiritual attacks. Again, we may not have done that consciously. It could be for a variety of reasons, but we can open the door to spiritual attacks. Scripture confirms that, but that does not mean that we cannot get deliverance from that, freedom, from the attacks of the enemy. We just have to be aware with it and fight, with spiritual warfare. So if we have done that, I think it's a great idea, or even if we're not sure, it's a great idea to ask the Lord for forgiveness, asking him to break whatever curse we may have knowingly or unknowingly walked into or agreed to, maybe even things that our ancestors did, that we had no idea that they came into a pact with the devil, or practice witchcraft, sorcery, all sorts of these things. And, if you've done it before, great. And if you haven't, I would really encourage you to pray to God about this, and to really be intentional. If you've tried different things with your family, with your marriage, with your children, you've tried, medication, you've tried counseling, you've tried, speaking to a wise person at your church, a wise minister, your pastor, and, still things seem to not be working. It could be a spiritual attack. It could be a demonic influence that's trying to take hold of your thoughts, of your mind. And the battle is really fought in the mind. Okay, so going on to depression, some symptoms can be different in boys and girls. So for example, for girls, it might be socially acceptable for them to display sadness, for them to cry, especially young girls. For boys, what are the messages that we've been taught, through our culture, through our tradition, maybe even our family system? Boys don't cry. It's not okay to cry. And so what happens, a boy who might feel very sad and might feel just depressed and not know it, might feel hopeless and helpless, instead of maybe being cryful or tearful in their emotion, they might actually display depression as anger. So this can be seen very often with school-age boys, teenage boys, where you won't see them crying in a corner because that would be displaying quote-unquote weakness. But what is socially acceptable for males is to display anger, because for whatever reason, we've seen that as a sign of being macho, as a sign of strength for men, for males. For females, for girls, like I mentioned, certain other emotions could be acceptable. Helplessness, that could be an emotion or a display of emotion that we can encourage in girls. The sort of the damsel in distress, where somebody, the girl doesn't have what it takes to be able to, learn about herself, to find her identity, to learn about the strengths within her, the strengths that God sees in her. We are taught through society, through, different, even Disney movies, right? We wait for, somebody else to come and save the girl in distress. So these are socially acceptable behaviors and thoughts and actions that have been kind of placed on us by society. And that's why we can see depression look differently in boys and girls. So for boys, again, they can have acting out behaviors. They can be destroying property. They can be hitting a wall. And of course, anger is definitely in there. But at the root of it, it could be deep, deep sadness that they don't even know that they're experiencing. So some cognitive symptoms might show up first before the feelings start to set in. The feelings of hopelessness, helplessness, they might follow after failing a test, not passing a class, after a breakup, after not getting enough likes, on a picture or a story or a post. So usually the feeling is followed in these cases by an event that happened. But if this is a purely psychological source of depression, it may not have a specific event linked to it. So some psychological symptoms that we can notice in young people, even in ourselves, we might notice that we're agitated. We're just really easily irritated. Every little thing sets us off. Whereas if we weren't feeling this way, if we weren't feeling anxious, stressed, overwhelmed, even depressed, we would be able to tolerate that, but because of many different reasons, especially right now, I can't speak enough about how stressful this time is for a lot of people. People have lost jobs, people have had income slashed. There's a lot of uncertainty, both about, physical well-being, emotional well-being, and fill in the blank. There's just a lot of uncertainty. So in this time especially, we can feel a little bit more irritated, a little bit more agitated, where if we weren't feeling this way, we would be able to tolerate certain things. We can also feel fatigued, and young people, can display this as well. So people who, young people who might sleep all day long, and while maybe more sleep is needed during the teenage years because, they are growing, they're adopting, they're in that bridge between childhood and adulthood. So their body is adopting in different ways. Puberty might be setting in or have already set in. So fatigue can be a real expression of depression, in that it's hard for them to even get out of bed. There's no motivation to get out of bed. Things that didn't used to tire them are tiring them now, to the point where they just feel overwhelmed. Everything takes so much energy. Even getting out of bed takes so much energy. Brushing one's teeth, getting something nutritious to eat, like everything just seems so overwhelming, and we can be left feeling this fatigue. But like I mentioned, we might notice changes in sleeping patterns, so either sleeping too much or having insomnia, having trouble either falling asleep, staying asleep, or interrupted sleep. So when we experience depression, our sleep is definitely one of the telltale signs that something is not right. We can also notice changes in appetite or weight. We can either gain weight in a rapid amount of time or lose weight. And this is not due to biological issues, because sometimes some biological conditions can impact our weight. For example, thyroid issues. If someone has a hypothyroid or hyperthyroid, those are medical issues that can impact our weight, that can impact our biological system. So this is different than that. We want to explore some other reasons before thinking automatically it could be this. Also, slow speech and movement, having headaches or stomach aches, especially for younger kiddos that might not be able to express their thoughts and feelings. They might complain a lot about having a stomach ache. And it could be that they're just feeling really sad or very worried and don't know how to express that. Other aches and pains can be experienced as well. A lot of shoulder pain, a lot of upper back pain, even some lower back pain, some tightness in our joints, so when people are anxious or depressed, and we will get into the anxious piece, but when we are anxious, we will clench our fists. We will, display kind of this body language, very tight and closed. We might also clench our jaw. We carry a lot of tension in our jaw. So if we wake up in the morning and our jaw is starting to hurt, it could be that during the night, because of stress, because of anxiety, we are clenching everything up. So that could also be a telltale sign your body is giving you that something is not right. So in older children and in teenagers, their source of depression could very likely be relational. Peer relationships take more importance, believe it or not, in the teenage years, in many cases, than parental relationships. Why? Because during the teenage years, teenagers are trying to find their identity, just like we talked about yesterday with the developmental stages. They're trying to figure out, who am I? At church, they're telling me this, the Bible tells me this, but society is telling me something different. So there can be a disconnect. There can be confusion that wasn't there in earlier years, and that can lead a child, a young person, even a young adult feeling depressed. Why? Because they don't quite subscribe to what society is pushing on them, but they don't know how to find their place in this world, in this life. Relationships with family members can be a huge trigger for depression as well. That could apply for young children, for teenagers, young adults, even adults, married couples. So our relationships with others, that can be a trigger for us to experience depression. If there has been a separation, if there has been a falling out, with extended family members. Of course, if there has been a loss of a loved one, so many people are losing their life, especially in these past few months. That can definitely be, well, first that would be grief, that would be bereavement, but if untreated, if we don't allow a person to process that, over time it can lean to depression. Friendships can be a real stressor that may also be contributing to depression. So some signs and symptoms that we've talked about with depression: helplessness. So this is feeling like nothing I ever do is good enough. I can try and try and try, but I am worthless. I will never learn from mistakes of my past. I will never get better. Things are never going to change. So a feeling of helplessness can come in and overwhelm us. We can think of it as like this cloud that is always over us, no matter how hard we try. So that could be one sign of depression, of just feeling very helpless, having thoughts of death, not wanting to be here anymore. A lot of the work that that I do with young people in particular, they feel very guilty about what they're feeling. They don't want to be a burden to their parents, to their siblings. They know that, with them feeling depressed or anxious, that something's not right, and they feel really guilty. They don't want to be a burden to their parents or their family members. So they think the better alternative is maybe wishing that they weren't here anymore. But we definitely want to pay attention to those signs. Some people might, write a suicide note, and they might be intentional about, sharing that with you or wanting, it could be a cry for help. They could be, needing some support and don't know how to express it. So some, like I mentioned, some people might have planned it all the way through. Some people just don't want to be a burden to their parents. So they don't know how else to cope with that than to express, maybe it's better if I weren't here anymore. So I don't want us to be alarmed if we hear things like that. We definitely want to be cautious and wise. It's not a reason to panic. Why? Because if a child brings that to you, if a young person brings that to you, at the core, they don't want to die. They want help. They want support. And so if you have a young person who expresses that to you, do your best to, in that moment, show empathy. If a hug is appropriate, maybe showing warm signs of affection. If it's not, thanking them for sharing this with you, not judging them, right? Not being critical about it. Why? Because it took a lot for this young person to share these feelings with you. So we definitely want to encourage a sense of safety and trust, so that whatever the enemy's trying to put in their mind, in their thoughts, in their brain, we can counter that with different things. I want to be mindful of our time and move on here. So weight changes, we talked about that, feeling super guilty, abandoning things that they used to enjoy. Maybe it was a sport, maybe they used to enjoy drawing, maybe they used to sing or play an instrument, right? Or they enjoyed playing with their siblings, and now all of a sudden you don't see that anymore. They've abandoned these hobbies and interests. That could be a sign of depression that we want to be mindful of. Having difficulty breathing, right? Having different changes in their appetite. And this is not normal changes in appetite. This could be just wanting either overeating, right, or binging, or not eating. So that would fall into anorexia. A lot of times, young people who have, or just people in general who have eating disorders, they are comorbid, meaning they are also experiencing depression or anxiety. So if you notice a young person, or even yourself, somebody that you know, experiencing an eating disorder, it could very well be that they are also experiencing depression, anxiety, and some of the other mental health issues that we've talked about. Anger is another one. And just like we talked about earlier, there are some socially acceptable emotions based on gender, based on age, that we can encourage or discourage in a young person. So anger can be encouraged, whether willingly or knowingly or unknowingly. We can encourage that in boys, but discourage that in girls. So what happens is when a young person is depressed, we can say a male, they will express that in anger, whereas a girl, a female, might express that in tearfulness and sadness, in isolation. Okay. The children in this day and age, it's interesting because this generation materially has probably the most of any other generation. You know, they might have designer attire, they might have, you know, a car, they might have other material things, the fanciest cell phone out there, laptop, you know, big screen TVs, all these material things that other generations didn't have, but they've actually been deprived of a normal, or a healthy, I will say, a healthy childhood. Why? Because in this day and age, we are seeing a difference in the emotional availability of parents. Just like technology has kind of impacted young people, they've also impacted how our adults and older adults even relate with one another, and the amount of time that we spend on technology. So different things can distract our attention as parents, as adults, and that causes a disservice to our young person. Why? Because parents think, oh, you know, if I buy them the fanciest TV, you know, if I buy them all the games that they want, if I buy them all the clothes that they want, that I didn't have that growing up. I didn't have those fancy toys growing up, we tell ourselves. So I'm doing a good job at parenting by buying all of these material things for my child. But the reality is, children can play with anything. They can play with a cardboard box, you know, if we allow them to. They can, you know, nurture and harvest creativity without being overly stimulated by the apps, by video games, by all these technological devices that vie for their attention. So some other components of parenting are having clearly defined limits. Just like we talked about yesterday and the day before, having a structure, having a routine, having a sense of predictability, even being, like we mentioned, being as boring as possible, which means being as predictable as possible. Why? Because then you don't have decision fatigue. You know everything that you need to do during the day. It's kind of scheduled for you. You don't have to be overwhelmed with just, you know, trying to find time for everything. You can loosely, of course, we want to be flexible as well. But having clearly defined limits for your children is going to bring a sense of safety and structure that is not going to be there if you don't put any limits on your children. For example, a lot of parents might think, well, my kid is a teenager. They're old enough to know, you know, when to use the phone, when to not use the phone. I don't want to be an overbearing parent because I had that growing up, and I don't want to be that to my parents. So to my child can use whatever they want all day long, all night long, in terms of technological devices. And we have seen with research, with practice, that having a lack of limits actually creates a lot of problems for our young people. Why? Because they just don't know how to stop. They don't know how to put the device away, you know, and so it can lead to very anxious feelings, the fear of missing out, because they constantly have to be on the apps. You know, like, did I miss anything that somebody posted? You know, am I getting enough enough likes. And so what happens is we don't actually live our life. We are encouraging this lifestyle of everything being filtered through technology, when if we had some clearly defined limits and stuck to them. Again, I'm not saying this is easy, but if we do the work on the front end, long term, there are going to be some benefits for everybody. So, if we are lax in our limit setting, of course, we want to be reasonable and flexible as well. But having some kind of structure is going to help bring safety. And if there's safety, there is trust, and a young person will know what to expect. If we know our limits, just like if we know our limits in our relationship with God, we don't have to experiment with certain things that are going to be harmful for us, because we know this is for my protection, and this is where I'm going to stay for safety. Whether or not they express it that way, having clearly defined limits is going to create a sense of safety that is very important and very lacking in this day and age. Responsibilities. We want to take into account the age of each young person, whether they're really young children or maybe they're teenagers, and encourage a sense of responsibility in each of them. So for some families, it works to have a chore list, so everybody knows, this person takes the trash out, that person vacuums, this person will help us dust or clean, wipe things down. For some families, that works to have, like a chore schedule, or just some sort of visual where everybody knows what they need to do. For some people, it could be like every day we do this, For other people, it could be, it can look different in every family. But we definitely want to encourage some responsibility with our young people. Why? Because if they feel responsible for something and they feel like you trust them with that, they're going to take ownership of that. And there's going to be a sense of satisfaction, a sense of acknowledgement, a sense of accomplishment, that's going to come with fulfilling whatever responsibility that you assign them to. So I would say not to shy away from that. Again, be flexible. Don't put on too much onto a young person, but they want to be a part of something, especially this generation. They want, to bring good to this, to their families, to their communities, to their churches, their youth groups, and to the world. So we want to give them a sense of responsibility so that they can start to find a sense of purpose. And it doesn't have to look, it doesn't have to be exclusively chores. It can be other things as well, but giving them a sense of responsibility is quite helpful. Also, encouraging some sort of movement, creative play, social interaction, and the opportunity to be bored, because boredom is good, So I will just kind of quickly gloss over this slide, but we talked a bit about being emotionally present for our children and having digitally distracted parents and what that can do. It can make a young person, a child, feel like they're not good enough, if mom and dad are on their phone, or caregivers on their phone all the time. So they might develop a sense of insecurity. Why? Because they're trying really hard to gain the parents' attention. Some kids might actually go up to their parents and wave in front of them to try to get some kind of eye contact, some kind of, a reality check to their parent. And sadly, a lot of parents are consumed with their own problems, their own issues, their own trauma that they have not dealt with. And so they can turn to digital distractions to try to forget what's happening for them. So quickly, we'll go on to anxiety. And for each person, it can look differently. But here we have, a visual of what it can look like. For some people, it can be irritability. So just like somebody who's depressed may experience irritability, somebody who's anxious can also experience that as well. We also have obsessive behaviors. So for some people, and anxiety can be on a spectrum. At the very edge could be, some obsessive compulsive disorders. that can lead to certain things, certain routines needing to be practiced over and over again, as well as some compulsive thoughts that go along with it. That doesn't let the person just calm down, relax. Like they feel like they have to do this thing over and over again, and this ritual over and over again in order to feel calm. So obsessive behaviors, overscheduling and overworking, because they just feel like they're never enough. And so they might just have way too much on their plate and feel anxious and overwhelmed. We might overindulge. We might actually feel dizzy or numb. Sleep issues can come into play here as well. Just like with depression, lacking concentration can also show up with anxiety, just like with depression. And we can experience some avoidance behavior. So because we are anxious about a school assignment that we don't quite know how to do, because we're anxious about all the responsibilities we have during the day, what happens? We procrastinate. So procrastination a lot of times can be linked to anxiety, just having anxiety about a task being too challenging, too overwhelming, not knowing how to do it. And so we can procrastinate and avoid certain responsibilities. So anxiety, I'm going to just kind of leave this graph up here. And whoever, would like the presentation, Brother Josh and Sister Jeanette are going to have access to it, so you guys can go through these slides. But these are different ways that it can show up with children. So the question can arise of, is this normal anxiety, or is this a disorder? So it is normal to feel some type of reaction during stress or difficult times. It's normal to sometimes feel nervous, to feel stressed, to feel just maybe sometimes overwhelmed. So these are normal emotions, but it's how often and how intense that we feel them that can make a difference. And so here on both sides of this graph, we have, a normal reaction as well as a disorder, what that looks like. Okay, so here we have coping skills. There are all kinds of coping skills that we can look at, and we don't have time to go into, just, because of the nature of the session. So we can have coping skills aimed at calming the body. We can have coping skills aimed at, bringing awareness to our thoughts and to our mind. So some of the coping skills that we listed here is, when you think this, try this instead. So if you think, or your child or somebody that you know thinks, I can never do anything right. I'm such a failure. I mess it up every time. We want to insert an alternative response. We might feel like we have to act on our impulses, but actually we can take a deep breath, take a moment of calm, and we can think before we react. We don't have to give in to every thought, to every feeling that comes into our mind. And when we think, I have no control over my reactions, and this could be conditioning over time. Maybe this is the message that we received growing up, that we don't have control over our own reactions. Why? Just like we talked about yesterday, some phrases that can come up like, you made me get mad. You made me lose my temper. You made me do this. If parents are communicating that in their families, the message that they're actually communicating is that they don't have dominion over their own thoughts and feelings and behaviors. And so the message that's being heard on the other end by their kids is that, okay, if mom and dad don't have control over their thoughts and feelings, why should I think that I do? So I have no control over my reactions. And this can lead to a sense of helplessness, a sense of hopelessness that can intensify later on. So our emotions are definitely, they are normal in terms of we all have them, but we might think that because I only feel sad right now, because I only feel depressed, that just makes me be a miserable, depressed person. But actually, our emotions are a sign of us processing information. And there are ways to manage our emotions. Okay, so somebody had asked, I think it was on the first night, about what to do when somebody is experiencing an anxiety attack. So there are some things called grounding techniques that we take ourselves out of our thoughts and we actually bring ourselves to the present moment. So one of these examples is this that we have on the screen, the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. This is a grounding exercise. And what we want to do if somebody is feeling like an anxiety attack is coming on, they're noticing the triggers in themselves, the cues that, okay, I'm having trouble breathing, I'm starting to feel a bit dizzy, I'm feeling overwhelmed. We can take a moment, pause, breathe in deeply through our nose, and so that our belly feels it, and we want to breathe out through our mouth. This is intentional breathing. This is very different than the breathing that you and I are doing right now without thinking about it. When we do intentional breathing, breathing in deeply through our nose and out through our mouth, this is a reset for your brain. This is telling your brain, we're going to be okay. I am starting to get enough oxygen because we're starting to breathe in deeply through our diaphragm, through our belly, stomach area. So this is an instant reset. Like I said, an instant way to cope for your brain, so it doesn't lead to an anxiety attack. But if you're starting to breathe and you're still noticing, this maybe this feeling of hurt, of pain in your chest, and it's not a heart attack, but you're feeling this anxiety coming on, we want to engage all 5 senses in this moment. So I would encourage you to ask yourself or ask, another person. It's kind of a fun thing if you can practice this with somebody else. Name 5 things you can see, so we can look around the room. I see, 5 circle objects. I see, and you can incorporate color as well. I see, this green plant. I see this green sweater. Incorporating color and shapes is really going to get your minds out of that. And it seems like a tunnel. Like it seems like you're not going to get out of this anxiety attack. But again, if we invoke and if we involve all 5 of our senses, we are taking ourselves out of our brain and into the present moment. Can you guys hear me okay? Give me a second here. Thank you guys for your patience. Okay, so are we still okay?
Yes, we're still good.
Okay. Sorry guys. Okay, if we're still okay, then I'll just keep going, all right? I saw here there's technical difficulty, but if somebody can respond if everything's okay, we'll keep going. Alrighty, the next component is something you can touch. So the sensations, right, of even the clothes on your skin, does that feel soft? Does that feel itchy? Does that feel smooth? So really engaging all of the textures around you. How does the seat underneath you feel? Or if you're standing, how do your toes feel in, digging into the ground? Do you feel sweat on your palms? How does your hair feel in this moment? Let's touch your hair, touch your head. Anything to take the attention away from whatever overwhelming thought is coming in is going to help reduce the likelihood of engaging in a full-blown anxiety attack or panic attack. Okay, and then 3 things you can hear, 2 things you can smell, 1 thing you can taste. And it doesn't have to be, if you find yourself needing to do a grounding exercise in the moment and you're like, what was that again? 5 things I can smell, 4 things, like, it's okay. You don't have to, remember exactly how this goes. This is kind of a general guideline. But more often than not, in the moment, we can see more things than we can taste. So that could be a good, helpful reminder if when you're trying to think, what was a 5, 4, 3, 2, 1? Just think, okay, I can see a lot more than I can taste in this moment. So maybe start with seeing with sight, and then touch, sound, smell, and like I mentioned, taste. So this exercise might sound simple, but in the moment, if you're feeling overwhelmed and need a reset button, or if a student that you're working with or a young person you're working with is experiencing this, then we definitely want to help calm them down. Okay, so addiction, moving right along. Some people say the opposite of addiction is abstinence, right? Is sobriety. And while there may be truth to that, the reality is if we feel connected, if we have a connection, a God connection, emotional connection to something, some people say that is actually the opposite of addiction. So the cause of addiction, and it could be a drug addiction, this could be eating disorder, right? So maybe binging on food, maybe it's gambling, maybe it's pornography, that we'll get into a little bit in the next couple slides. All of this can be linked to a lack of connection. So when we do not feel connected, if we feel alone in our pain, if we feel alone in our suffering, one of the things that can happen is we can turn to things that in the moment we might not realize that they will lead to addiction. But what happens is the brain gets a rush of dopamine when we are exposed to some of these things. So for young people, they might get a rush of dopamine when they try, a substance, or when they, see things that they shouldn't see. And what happens is that is addicting. The brain then tells the person, yeah, you felt really good when you accessed that before, right? Don't you want to do that again? And because the person wants to feel some sense of normalcy, some sense of feeling okay and connection, what happens is they'll fall into this trap of opening the door to behaviors and thoughts that are addicting. And then later on, it's very, very difficult for the person to realize how they even got there in the first place. And it's very difficult for them to notice some triggers, some things that are causing them to engage in these addictive behaviors or addictive practices. So we definitely want to think about that. So I want you to think about maybe a young person that you work with, a young person in your family, and before we are quick to point fingers of condemnation, yes, some things need to be rebuked, and we need to pray against spirits that are trying to influence us to fall into these addictive traps. And at the same time, we can take inventory and see, does this young person feel a sense of emotional connection, a God connection? Do they have a sense of purpose? Because a lot of times they might tell you, I don't have anything going in my life. I feel so depressed and so sad, and falling into this addiction, this is the only thing that makes me feel quote unquote normal. So we definitely want to explore, how connected or not connected a young person can be before we think about ways to treat the addiction. So like I mentioned, we can pray against certain spirits. For some people, they've, had God deliver them overnight from an addiction. And for other people, it has been a longer process, they've prayed and prayed and prayed, but they still struggle with this thing. For some people, it's in collaboration with prayer, with connection, and counseling as well, to be able to notice some of the signs, some of the triggers, some of the cues in their body or in the thoughts that can bring them to start these addictive patterns all over again. So for each person, it can look different, and we want to be mindful of that. So just like I put a disclaimer earlier, we have a slide here about pornography addiction. And the reason that we're incorporating this into the presentation is because pornography addiction is so rampant, so common in this day and age, from young people to adults. So I think the enemy doesn't want us to, bring clarity or to learn about the weapons of the enemy, but we are here today to kind of take a lid off these things that the enemy has afflicted our young people with, or even our adults, and to look at it in different aspects. So spiritually, that this can be an attack of the enemy. If we look at the brain, what happens in the brain when these addictive behaviors take place, we can see here that once a person is addicted, once they get that rush of dopamine or that belief that they feel good, they're going to keep coming back for more. So that's the addiction piece. The escalation, phase 2, over time, the same level of being exposed to certain images or certain substances, they're not getting that same dopamine rush with the same level of this input. So what happens is they escalate it, like maybe before they were only seeing certain types of things. Now they've stepped it up a level. Now they're trying different substances more often, more amounts. And so this is what happens in the brain when we start to escalate, when we need more to maintain that same quote unquote level of satisfaction that the brain is telling you that it wants. Then phase 3 is desensitization. So for some people, they can actually start accessing illegal forms of this addiction, and it can come in all shapes and sizes. For some people, it can turn to child pornography. For some people, they can, just do or seek out different people, different behaviors to feed that same level of a dopamine rush that the brain is releasing. And then 4 is acting out. So you might then notice some sexually aggressive behavior, from the young person or from the person, because they've taken their fantasies and their thoughts to a whole other level. Again, in that search for something that they think that they need, because they don't have a connection elsewhere. They're not maybe connected as much as they could be to God. They may not be connected as much as they could be to their spouse, to their family members, to the ministry that God has called them to. So with addiction, again, when we notice a lack of connection, that's when we can see some of these behaviors or these thoughts getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and us giving more power to them, or young people giving more power to them. Another component of porn addiction specifically, but other addictions as well, somebody who has been abused sexually or has been assaulted sexually as a child or adolescent, teenager, they may be more likely to access some of this because they're not quite sure how to process what happened to them. Maybe in the moment of the assault, of the abuse, they didn't know what to do. And so they blame themselves, thinking it was totally my fault. I should have done this. I shouldn't have done that. And it leads to, just feeling overwhelming shame. And that is part of their identity, this shame. When we add addiction to it, the levels of shame increase that much more. And so for the sake of time, I'm just going to go on to the next couple pieces here. So self-esteem or self-efficacy, a lot of our young people are dealing with, and even adults, even in this, in this time period, believing that we're not competent enough, we're not good enough, that even if we try our hardest, that things aren't going to turn out the way that we want them to. So having a confidence or lack of confidence in our ability to have control over our emotions, our behavior, and social environment are very important, because they can play into the identity or lack of identity with our young people. So self-efficacy is feeling like it's very, some people will say that they're interchangeable with self-esteem. So having a strong sense of self-efficacy is viewing problems as something that, if we put our mind to it, we can accomplish this. If we have a difficult assignment, yes, it's going to take a lot of work. Yes, it's going to take time, but we can do it if we put our mind to it. Somebody who has a strong sense of self-efficacy is going to believe that they can do the things that they want to do. If they have a setback, if they have a disappointment, if they have, something like a failure, they're not going to feel like a failure. They're going to just recognize it for what it is. Sometimes we win, sometimes we don't. People with a weak sense of self-efficacy, they can actually, like we talked about earlier, when we procrastinate, it's because maybe we feel anxious, maybe we feel inadequate, maybe we feel like we don't have what it takes to do whatever challenging task is in front of us. So we want to take note of that. Maybe we believe that we don't have the skills, we don't have the capabilities that it takes in order to do whatever it is that we need to do, and it can be something, again, as simple as I can't do this thing that I used to be able to do before, but I can't do now. Somebody with a weaker sense of self-efficacy or a lower sense of self-efficacy can quickly lose confidence in things that before weren't an issue. So I'm going to gloss over some of these examples, but just very quickly, somebody, just like we mentioned, someone who feels confident that they'll be able to learn the information that's being presented for them and do well on a test, they would have a strong or high level of self-efficacy. And then we're going to allow you to read some of those other examples on your own. So these are 4 building blocks of how we can build self-efficacy in children. So allowing them to master an experience, and it can be age appropriate for some people. It can be, for some children, potty training. That's a wonderful example. If they feel like they can master potty training, they're going to feel like they can master or accomplish other tasks. But if they feel like a failure, I'm, wetting my diaper when I don't want to, my mom or my dad is being really harsh, very critical of me, and I'm trying really hard here, but I just can't get this potty training thing worked out. The children could struggle with the mastery of experience, and that can lead to a decrease in their self-efficacy. So we want to, as adults, create experiences that young people can master, and we can definitely start small. So if you notice a young person in your life lacks in this area, they have really low self-esteem, they have really low self-efficacy, maybe we want to present them the opportunity to master small experiences, or at least gain skills in those small experiences. And with each small win, they're going to notice a sense of accomplishment, and that's going to build on their sense of self-efficacy. We also want to model socially, so children observe from their peers, they observe from their parents. So when they observe some of this constructive modeling from others, it's going to help them believe that they can do it too. So if mom or dad, they're faced with these very difficult situations, but they're still optimistic, they still believe that they can accomplish it, what happens is the child is going to also believe that they can do this too. So that is going to be quite helpful for the young person to start to build on these blocks of self-efficacy. 3 is going to be social persuasion. So when children get specific verbal encouragement from others, especially the parents, because that is the strongest attachment that they have growing up. Even their peers as well, but especially parents, when they receive positive words, when they receive, praise, even when they receive expressions of "I love you," that is something that is going to encourage the young person to believe, okay, my mom and dad love me. Maybe I can begin to love myself too. 4 is going to be a psychological response. So if we feel like we can manage our emotions, we're going to feel like we can succeed at different tasks at hand. So I'm going to skip over these tips that you guys can read about, but we really, if we don't gain anything else from this presentation or this seminar, we want to find ways to connect emotionally, right? So we've discovered and explored that connection, having a sense of connection, is so important for many different reasons. And when we feel disconnected, that can really have a negative impact on our mental health, our physical health, on the development of our young people, of our children. And so we want to find ways to connect emotionally. Don't leave that task to your church staff specifically or exclusively, I would say. Don't leave that task to your pastor exclusively. Why? Because if these are your children, God has entrusted you to teach them good things, to model good things, so that the goodness of God can shine through you. And your children are going to be your family is going to be your first ministry, right? And so there's always going to be, somebody else or something else trying to fight for your attention. But if you've chosen, to enter into a relationship with somebody, if you've chosen to get married with them, if you've chosen to have children, then you have chosen this as your primary ministry. For those people who are single, and those people who, are divorced or separated and maybe don't have a romantic relationship, but they have other types of relationships, friendships, we also want to encourage them to connect emotionally, because we all live in a connection with everyone else. God created us to crave connection. And of course, the first connection should be with God first, seeking that kind of connection, but we can also extend that to being emotionally connected as well. Okay, so I'm going to allow you guys to read these tips on your own. And I want to just kind of conclude by saying that a big tip, and we've been seeing different tips through the past few days, but a big tip that I want to leave you with and reiterate is that you can believe that healing and restoration is yours. By highlighting these different mental health issues, it's not to create a negative, hopeless picture. It's to, again, bring light to some of these issues that plague us as a society, that plague our young people, that plague our families, our churches, and our community. And by bringing light to these things, by being aware of what the enemy tries to use against us, we can then take steps from that. We can believe that healing is ours. We can believe that we don't have to continue these same destructive patterns that maybe were placed on us knowingly or unknowingly by past generations. We can seek a new life in Christ. So I am here to say that there is help out there. If you want to lean on your youth pastors, if you want to lean on your pastor or other people to maybe help with your young people, also seeking out faith-based counseling can be helpful to allow your young person the opportunity to express themselves. And maybe they don't quite feel comfortable, sharing everything to you as a parent or you as an adult in their life, but there might be some value in getting another perspective. This could also be helpful to engage a godly counselor into the mix. Okay. Well, we have reached the end of our presentation. Thank you guys so much for bearing through. I know we went a little bit extra, but I really wanted to be thorough and cover all of the things that we wanted to cover today. So thank you guys for watching, and thank you for being with us this morning.
All right. Thank you, Sister Gabi. That was an incredible teaching today on the mental health component. That was very, very eye-opening, I would say, because sometimes we just kind of get, we don't really think about, how to necessarily help with coping with
Mm.
our young people. Sometimes we just kind of like, sometimes we just move things along and just hope they get better. There are some questions.
Okay.
This was actually a question from last night, and it's one that we wanted to push to this morning because it definitely goes with what we were talking about. And it says this: if a child or teenager is already experiencing drugs because it helps them forget, what steps should a parent take to lead to recovery?
Okay. That's a great question. Um, so I think I would ask the young person, or I would ask the parent if they know what the child is trying to forget. Is it abuse? Is it just forgetting the reality? Maybe the home is there's just a lot of chaos happening there, and the young person might turn to drugs as an escape of their reality.
Hmm.
So I would encourage the parent, to ask the young person, or for the young person to think about what is it that they're trying to forget. Are they trying to forget the person that they've become? Maybe the young person doesn't like who they are now. Maybe as a child, they were okay with who they were, but now as a teenager, maybe they just don't like who they are. So they're using drugs to try to escape that reality that they're no longer a child, not quite yet an adult. And so they're trying to use different substances to mitigate those feelings. I think if we would ask, people who use substances in particular, most, if not all, will say that at some point in their life or some point in their addiction, they've used substances in order to forget something that has happened in their life. And so trauma is a huge, huge piece in substance use. And so this is why I want somebody to ask this young person, what are you trying to forget? Because if it's trauma, then we need to address that. We can't just say stop with the substance use without, that's just a symptom, but the root is going to be, maybe they feel abandoned for whatever reason. Maybe there's been a separation. Maybe there's been financial stress in the home. Maybe there has been, just a lot of chaos, domestic violence even. So we want to really see what is deeper than that, because again, the substance use is a symptom of what's actually happening.
Right. Okay. So, thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry about that. There's substance use counseling that can also be helpful as well, so to identify different triggers and cues, so when are they more likely to use? Is it when they're alone in the afternoon? Is it when they're around certain people, around certain friends? Is it when they go to a certain part of town? So we want to really explore what are some people, places, and things that might make them more likely to use substances, because if we can get a bigger picture of what's happening besides the substance use, what's leading up to it, what happens after, the feelings that might come with, right before they use and afterwards, then we can address more of what the core is, what the root is. So seeking some kind of counseling could be helpful as well, in addition to all the other things that we talked about.
Excellent. Wow. Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you, Sister Gabi, for that answer. Next question is it considered a trauma for a child that has experienced their parents going through a divorce, even though both parents are involved still, and it was a fairly smooth transition?
Okay. It can be considered a rupture. It can be considered a rupture in, um, what the child has come to expect as normal. So their sense of normalcy can have been ruptured during this separation. And I think it's wonderful that both parents are still involved. I think, the best situation, the best scenario is to have both parents to be able to co-parent, because something that we didn't get into is that blended families, they can also have, another layer of everything that we've already talked about. So it could be that, the parents are doing everything that they can to support the child during this rupture in normalcy, but there could also be a new partner, a new spouse, that the child is like, well, who are you? I know who my mom and dad are. I love them, but now I'm being exposed to this other person that might be nice, but the child just might not know how to assimilate all of this information. So it could be, it's a spectrum, right? So it could be the best case of scenario. Everyone, has the best interest of the child at hand. Everyone's working together, showing the love and support, for the child. And so that could be the best case scenario. They're involved in church and ministry. There's a very wholesome support system there. And again, it can be a spectrum. So along that spectrum could also be that the child just maybe doesn't know how to process all of this information. So maybe in the moment they're either not liking this or they're going along with it, but later on they might be able to, really explore this whole process for them. So I would encourage, the parents who have, asked this question, not to give up and not to say it's a hopeless situation, but to notice that for even with siblings, one child can have this not be a trauma for them and the other one can. It could be deeply traumatic. So we want to notice those differences. We want to be as, empathetic as possible. So I guess to summarize that, best case scenario, it can be, a time of change for the child, and they're trying to assimilate all of this information. Worst case scenario, yeah, it could be something, traumatic that the child has not yet known how to process.
Okay. Another question that kind of goes with this, kind of the steps that we were talking about with what can we do to help with drug addiction. But also, this one is, how can I, as a parent, help my child if they've started cutting themselves? What are some tips or steps that we can do at home?
Okay. So a lot of times young people will cut because there's a kind of culture of secrecy in the home, right? So rather than it being able to express one's thoughts and feelings for the parents, even for the young person, everything is swept under the rug, and so what happens is we all feel something, but if we are taught this emotion is not okay for you to express, or it's not okay for you at all to express, the young person is going to express it in one way or another, and one of that could be turning that frustration, that sadness onto themselves. So, if a parent finds out about this, again, at all of these situations that we're talking about, we really want to approach them in a calm manner, first of all, in a kind of non-judgmental manner in that moment, because, kids are smart. If they can pick up, over criticism. I'm sorry. Uh, sorry about that. Criticism, excessive criticism. Of course, if, the young people needs to be called out on something that they're doing that's not correct, we want to not sugarcoat it, but talk about it. excuse me, just one moment. Yeah, so we want to approach this with compassion. We want to approach this with an open door, and sometimes an apology is needed from the adult to say, I am so sorry, Betty Sue, if maybe I've played a role in you feeling like you can't express your thoughts and feelings. And if I've done that before, I am really, really sorry. I want you to know I am genuinely sorry. I am here now, though. And if I can be of support to you, I am happy to do that. If there's maybe another family member that the youth might be more receptive to, or maybe a youth leader or a minister, or a counselor, then we definitely want to we definitely want to involve them as well. So if we seek help for a young person, well, there's a few things we could do. Once a young person enters into, say, a counseling office, if they come, if I see them, we want to create a safety plan. First of all, we want to, this might sound gory for people who are kind of blood, like squeamish, but we want to evaluate how deep are these cuts, and where are they cutting? Because if it's sort of like a nick, but not really deep, that could be the young person wanting somebody to find out, somebody, knowing what's happening, but they're not really intending to take their life. This could just be, like I mentioned, them wanting to share with somebody what they're thinking and feeling. So they could maybe lightly cut themselves, not too deeply. They could maybe not cut a vein, but kind of cut around that. So having a licensed counselor, having somebody who can help with this sort of thing, can be quite helpful to create a safety plan, to see what is the level of risk here, what is really happening again before, what are some cues, some triggers leading up to the cutting, because again, the cutting is a symptom. It is not actually the root of the problem. It could be the young person is depressed. It could be that something at school happened. It could be that maybe their parents are going through a separation and they don't know how to deal with that. So I hope that answers that question.
I think that answers it pretty well. I think we have one last question here for this morning, and I think it kind of sums up everything, and I think it's a pretty important question. How do we talk to our teenagers compared to how we talked to them when they were younger?
Okay. That is a wonderful question, because, this person is right. We can't speak to them like we would a little kid. Why? Because teenagers have developed their reasoning abilities. Their intelligence is at a different level than they were as a younger child. So a lot of times teenagers might ask, like, what's the point? What's the point in that? Why are you asking me to do this? Or why are you speaking to me in that tone? So I would say, try to think of how you would want to be spoken to when you were a teenager. So maybe this person as a teenager, they could have had parents who were very harsh, very critical, on them, and they wanted somebody to be able to be open with. So I really want this parent to think about, when you were a teenager, what is it that you needed at that time? And to let that start to guide your process of how to speak to a teenager. Because again, teenagers can talk back, they can be moody, they can be irritable. So I would say, if the parent feels triggered talking to this teenager, first I would encourage them to pray, to take some deep breaths, so they're not already, if their level of agitation is already here before they go and talk to the teenager, and one talking back from the teenager is going to push them over the top, then we don't even want to engage in that conversation, So first I would say, parent, see how you're feeling, see what you're thinking. If you need a moment of calm, take that moment of calm. If you need to go to the bathroom and take a deep breath for 5 minutes and then approach the teenager, do that. But really be mindful of what's happening, and I think that will really inform how you speak to the teenager and what tone you'll use. Don't be condescending, because teenagers are very intelligent and they will pick up on that. Don't be overly critical. Of course, like I said, things need to be called out, we call them out, but teenagers are not going to respond to somebody who is overly critical on them, who never sees anything positive in them. So I would encourage this parent to do an evaluation of some of these things before they consider, talking to the teenager.
All right. Great. Okay. So we'll end there today, and we'll end our digital family seminar. Hopefully, our very first digital family seminar. We hope to do this more. We want to thank Sister Gabi again for joining us here and for giving us tremendous amounts of helpful information. I love that we're getting those tips there at the end. It's kind of just like, here's what you can do now with this information. So thank you so much for that. It's very easily digestible for us and just fantastic.
And Brother Josh, I just want to say, if people have questions, they're welcome to email me or contact me as well. I am on Instagram at Therapy with Gabi. If they want to send a DM or question directly, they're welcome to do that.
Okay, so that is Therapy with Gabi. Yeah, and you can just find her. So if if anyone has me on Instagram, you all can find her through me as well. So I do want to encourage you all to reach out to her. She's an excellent resource. And Sister Gabi may not know this yet, but I'm definitely going to be hitting her up more as a youth pastor and going through some stuff, with young people. She's definitely going to be a resource for us. So thank you again, Sister Gabi. Thank you.
I'm happy to help. Thank you. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
I do want to say thank you to our pastor and Sister Johnson, for allowing us to put this digital family seminar. Thank you to the leadership of our church that has believed in us to start something like this. We hope to increase this and be able to do this more. And for all of you that are watching, please share this out. Share this out to everyone, no matter what church, no matter what organization. This is an amazing resource for every family to take hold of. And so if you have any suggestions or anything, we're very willing to hear them. And if you, once again, have any questions or anything that you want to say, you can message us at that number that was displayed. Thank you again to everyone that's been here. God bless you all. And I pray that we have an amazing revival in this season. Love you all. God bless you.
God bless you.